and displacement, topics that are as timely as they are critical. Her research delves into the evolving landscapes of South African cities, offering nuanced insights into the socio-spatial dynamics of places like Johannesburg's Maboneng precinct and Cape Town's Woodstock neighborhood. These areas, while celebrated for urban regeneration, also embody deep contestations over development, identity, and belonging. What makes Dr. Ah Goo's work so compelling is the ability to extend these urban critiques beyond the city into often overlooked rural contexts. More recently, Dr. Ah Goo has been part of a multidisciplinary team led by Professor Ronnie Donaldson of Stellenbosch University, exploring how similar processes of gentrification are unfolding in rural hamlets around Stellenbosch, pushing us to think more expansively about spatial inequality and change. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Ah Goo is also working on a forthcoming book titled The Art of Resistance, Contesting Gentrification and Displacement in Cape Town, South Africa. This exciting work promises to challenge and inspire as it unpacks the paradoxical role that art and artists play in challenging and contributing to gentrification processes. With that, it is my absolute pleasure to invite to the stage our esteemed guest speaker, a scholar, critical thinker, and dedicated voice for inclusive cities, Dr. Ah Goo.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Wendy, Dr. Wendy, for that lovely warm welcome, and thank you to Biandri for inviting me in the first place, and thank you also to Dr. Fuyo and Prof. Fuyo and Prof. Barnard as well for your warm welcome, and thank you to all of you for being here today on what is probably the coldest day of this year so far, and it's nice also to see some familiar faces to some old friends. And Geert Marie was also on Vanderbilt Park campus at one stage. So thank you everyone then for being here today. Okay, so okay. Okay, so today, as was said, I'll be speaking about the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on cities, and particularly within the sphere of gentrification. So we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic had a devastating impact on all spheres of life. And together with the economic recession that followed, it compounded existing social and economic disparities in cities across the world. So who can ever forget then the devastating impact it had on our lives, on millions of people lost their lives, livelihoods were destroyed, we were separated from our loved ones, a disrupted education, the world of work and travel, and it had a lasting impact also on people's lives and well-being. It also worsened the already precarious situations that vulnerable people were in. And I mean, the list can actually go on, but thankfully we are out of that period. And but that pandemic has, in fact, still had some lasting impact in some instances.
Control side. Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
just us behind.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So sorry, that was meant to be the slide there then. Okay. So and so we've also had changes such as the new geographies of work. We work quite differently to the way we worked previously. There were new geographies of residence that also emerged as people adapted to the lockdown regulations that were in place at the time. There's also been the growth of Zoom towns. Okay, at Northwest, I suppose we mostly use Teams, but there were Zoom towns that also increased because of the pandemic, and people started migrating to smaller towns and villages from the larger and more densely populated cities because of this shift towards remote working and the desire to live in better quality spaces and also to have a better quality of life. So in South Africa, poverty also deepened and inequalities intensified, with some of the worst effects then being felt in cities. There were new patterns of urban change that were brought about by the pandemic, leading then to questions: what are the possible trajectories that cities would take? Questions also arose as to what a post-pandemic city could potentially actually look like. So my presentation then today looks at um, what effect does this actually have then? What effect does COVID-19 have then on urban redevelopment and more specifically then gentrification in the inner city of Johannesburg? So what is gentrification then? Okay, so gentrification is a form of urban redevelopment, or sometimes you'll see them referred to urban renaissance or regeneration, but by far it's the most contentious and the most contested form then of urban regeneration. So it refers to the production of space for progressively more affluent users, and it's also been adopted in cities across the world as a strategy to regenerate decaying inner city areas. So think about decaying Johannesburg. So it's a term that was coined more than 60 years ago in 1964 by Ruth Glass, and she was a British sociologist. She was a Marxist, and it followed her observations of what was going on in London. So this is what Ruth observed. She described gentrification as follows. So one by one, many of the working class quarters of London have been invaded by middle class, upper and lower, shabby modest mews and cottages. 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down have been taken over when their leases have expired and have become elegant, expensive residences. Um, this classic form of gentrification we can actually find across the world in places ranging from San Francisco to Singapore, and right here then also in South Africa, where you also see these colorful homes in Woodstock in Cape Town. However, gentrification no longer just involves the renovation of old historic buildings, as Glass first observed by these pioneer gentrifiers. It also involves the construction of high-rise luxury apartments, which have come to dominate then many of our gentrifying landscapes. So here in a very diverse part of the world, then in Kaka'ako, in Honolulu, in the United States of America, then you also see these huge condos being put up, what is known then as condofication, so a form of gentrification, but with the condominiums. And then in Woodstock, together with those historic houses that I showed you, you also have these luxury high-rise apartments going up, which often have been converted into Airbnbs, and they're often owned also by people who don't actually live there, often by overseas investors. But then gentrification is not only residential, it can also be commercial. So you'll also find trendy restaurants like you see in the image, coffee shops, craft breweries, boutiques, and art galleries as well. And old industrial spaces like the old biscuit mill that you see over here have also been repurposed into these commercial spaces. So who can guess what the old biscuit mill was before? It wasn't. It was an old biscuit mill. So they'll often use the name of what the place was before. What is that place in Potch? Snowflake. Yeah, there's an example of an industrial building also being repurposed because it was, I think, a flour mill then. Okay. Then we also have the ironworks in Woodstock as well. And you can guess it was also an ironworks. It was actually the site of Cape Town's first ironworks. And it's a mixed use development where you have residential, you've got commercial, you've also got office spaces as well. And ironworks also housed the first insect only restaurant in South Africa called Gourmet Grub, where you could order I think it's black fly larvae ice cream, or they had these mopani worms that you could even taste. That also gives you an idea of who the people are, that are coming to these places. So in addition, then the state has also increasingly become involved in gentrification, and the process has then become less driven by your individual gentrifiers, so your middle class people, or often artists are also the people who initially drive the process, and it's become then more developer led as well as more state led, and in some cases it's also state induced because of neoliberal policies. So you may be wondering, what's wrong with gentrification? I mean, it seemed like a pretty cool process. I mean, the cool places to go to, cool restaurants to eat in. In fact, Woodstock that I showed you had one of what was rated one of the best restaurants in South Africa, and in fact, people from all over the world would come there. Famous people too. I think Michelle Obama was also at one of those restaurants in Woodstock. So why is it actually contentious? I mean, it all sounds pretty good. You've got places being getting a facelift, houses getting a facelift, dilapidated buildings are being renovated, governments get increased revenue, crimes reduced, property prices, your house prices are going up, services improved, and you're getting the middle class also to come into inner city areas. Think about Johannesburg, where there are, I'm sure there's a huge proportion of people in Johannesburg who have never actually been to the inner city. So gentrification has also been a way of drawing middle class people to these areas. Okay. Oh, and I think I was actually fascinated even with gentrification when I was at school, because I went to school in central in Port Elizabeth, and they had all of these historical buildings with these nice fireplaces and beautiful old-fashioned sash windows and high ceilings and big rooms, and they were really gorgeous little houses. And but in the textbooks, there was actually nothing said about anything negative. You just heard about middle class people coming in and renovating these old homes. If you look at these pictures, also, this is in Woodstock, you'll see the art galleries, you'll see all of the art installations. So they look pretty cool. But as I was saying, the textbooks never spoke about the evictions. That were taking place, or forced displacement of people. And often a quote, I read you the quote earlier on by Ruth Glass, but often the other part of a quote that people don't actually quote is, she says, once this process of gentrification starts in a city, it goes on rapidly until all or most of the original working class occupiers are displaced, and the whole social character of the district is changed. So here, um, displacement then is the worst outcome of gentrification. And at the same time, you also have the social character. So often gentrifiers are attracted to these areas because it's got this historic character, or the community is diverse. There are different people living there. It's a mixed community and so on. But actually, in the end, it all changes and becomes a very homogenized area as well. So um, here's just also a photograph of some of the residents. I think this was in the United States, where on the placard he says, now that the neighborhood is nice, why do I have to move? So even initially, the regional residents may actually like what's going on. Yeah. I remember speaking to one of the youth there, and he was so excited because they were now having gyms in the area. They were having Bootleggers, which is a popular coffee shop in the area. So people often initially like the changes, but not realizing, in fact, along the line, what is actually going to happen to you, because your house prices may go up, your property may increase, but what's happening to your rates and taxes? That's also going to increase. And working class people, are they going to afford these increases in their rates and taxes? Okay, so Like I said, the evictions, the forced displacement, the homelessness, the rising rents, the increased housing costs, and then also your increased rates and taxes. So the regional residents then, even the homeowners, initially they may be protected, but eventually they could also be forced to leave then. Okay. So communities are also torn apart, social networks are disrupted, there's also economic exclusion. Think about it, would working class people want to buy a 30 Rand bottle of a small little bottle of water that costs 30 Rand or an expensive sandwich? So they are also excluded from all these new restaurants and all these offerings. And like that biscuit mill that I showed you, often the residents don't actually go there because it's so expensive. Um, in some cases, then you also have houses being razed to the ground and people being moved to the periphery of cities. And this has actually happened in different parts of the world, in Cape Town as well. Residents from Woodstock have been evicted. Like I'm sure you guys doing law would know much more than me about the PI Act, where the government also has to find alternative accommodation for people, but often the government gives them alternative accommodation on the periphery of the city. Okay, in faraway places, a place called Blikkiesdorp, in English that means Tin Can Town. So they live once in those beautiful Victorian homes, but now they're forced to live in these informal houses. So then what does this remind you of? Does it remind you of anything? Does it sound familiar? Is it a similar kind of model that we've seen before? Yes, absolutely. It reminds us of apartheid. So Atkinson and Bridge in 2005 already, and they, American authors, they spoke about gentrification as being a new form of colonialism. Um, in South Africa, I think Muyambo, she speaks about it as being a new form of social-spatial apartheid. And over here, the residents in Woodstock, they've got a placard where they also say in spatial apartheid. And Lise has also recently spoken about social apartheid, so where people are then separated then because of their class rather than the apartheid we know where people were separated according to their race, or what she then also refers to as urban apartheid, where you have then the spatial segregation of people. Okay, now let's turn then to the COVID-19 pandemic and what impact it had on gentrification processes. So with the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020 and the global recession that followed, some media outlets were then declaring that degentrification was taking place in cities like London and New York, and you see headlines like this from the Financial Times, which said, could the coronavirus then spell the end of trendy East London? Okay, and two debates then have emerged over the future of gentrification in your Anglo-American cities, your Anglo-American post-COVID-19 cities. So these two debates are, the one is about degentrification. On the other hand, you have disaster gentrification. So according to Hiram Lees, then the one debate predicts doom and gloom then for your center of your Anglo-American cities as the middle classes leave the suburbs, then for your smaller towns or your more rural locations, or gentrification then is killed off and it goes into decline, and a post gentrification city then emerges. In the other debate, then, Hara and Lees note that capital exploits the situation and gentrification carries on, and it may expand in inner cities as it finds ever more creative ways to exploit the urban. So the question then becomes, post COVID-19, will gentrification then die a sudden death, or will it continue as usual, exploiting new niches or mutating then as it's done then before in the past? So researchers have spoken about degentrification previously in the United States and in Great Britain when they had recessions. So we also, Temblador also puts it another way, and he says, is the pandemic then priming neighborhoods for a new wave of gentrification, or um, you also have in Los Angeles, then business owners also fear that the pandemic would actually hasten gentrification that encroach on your Latino, Asian, and Black communities and lead to displacement. So the displacement is also not only the residents that get displaced, but often also the small businesses in these inner city communities. So you have maybe that little corner shop that was there, or um, the, um, the what can I think of, the barber shop maybe, where residents were used to going. They often close down because there's a change, or there's a shift in the new people that move into the area. Okay. Then in South Africa, then these processes, in other words, the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as then the recession that followed, also brought about new patterns of change. And therefore, these two debates can also then be applied to our situation. So today, I want to explore then the phenomenon of degentrification, whether it is in fact occurring, but within then the city, the inner city of Johannesburg. And it's based really on my very preliminary observations of the Mabeneng precinct, which is in the east of Johannesburg's central business district. Okay, but before I delve into the issue of degentrification or disaster gentrification, I just want to give you then a brief background to the Mabeneng precinct. Okay, so the Mabeneng precinct, the regeneration there started in 2008 when the D.F. Corlett building, which is a 1930s Art Deco building, was then bought and converted into an arts-orientated complex called Arts on Main. And the development comprised then initially of art galleries, artist studios, creative venues, offices, a restaurant, and retail shops. And the precinct was then named Mabeneng because in Sesotho it actually means a place of light. So the developer wanted to create this enlightened community, people who define themselves then as being alternative or not fitting squarely into the mainstream. Perhaps you've heard of the word hipsters, so often they would identify themselves as being hipsters. And the transformation was then also hinged on Richard Florida's idea, or his notion of attracting then the creative class in order then to catalyze this process. So public art was the principal driver, and often we see that across the world. So it was also a driver for making place, and the developers then actually commissioned the local and international artists to create large-scale art murals on the buildings in the precinct, such as this 40-meter high painting of Nelson Mandela. And it was done to beautify the built environment, to create a positive image of the inner city because they wanted to attract more people to the inner city, and was also a way of creating a sense of place for the residents of Mabeneng. Here are some of the murals, and there's the mural of Nelson Mandela that I spoke about. But then, unlike what's been observed in a number of cities across the world, especially in the global north, the development of Mabeneng wasn't driven by, the spontaneous attempt of just a few middle class pioneers then moving in and trying to just transform a working class neighborhood with affordable accommodation. Instead, it was then driven by a single developer, um, um, and his efforts in at attracting artists and other creative people to the area. Then also at the same time with government support, because you had government having these incentives, and Mabeneng was um, declared an urban development zone, or maybe further of the term, a UDZ. So that also helped it. So often, if you read about Mabeneng, they often speak about it being this organic process, but it actually wasn't an organic process because you just had this one big developer coming in and trying to transform um, the area. Okay, so although Mabeneng was hailed both in your your international media. So before, maybe I should have mentioned this before, the inner city of Johannesburg was a crime hotspot. It was a no-go area. So these headlines, as you can see, this crime hotspot is transformed into a hipster hangout, or Mabuning precinct turns heads internationally, and or here it speaks about Johannesburg's SIP transformation. And as you can see, those are international news agencies. But then you had newspaper headlines like "Not everyone sees the light," or "Gentrification isn't good news for everyone." Um, and those sort of headlines show the contestations then surrounding the development. And the main criticism then was that was directed at the precinct was then the displacement of the poor due to gentrification. And for example, the women here in this photograph, as you can see, lying on just their mattresses that they have, very little belongings that they were able to take with them. So they were actually evicted from one of the buildings in the area, and they were forced to live underneath. This area is actually underneath a freeway bypass in Mabini. Concerns were also raised about the surrounding community, the working class community of Jeppestown, and also the people who worked in the informal sector who cannot actually afford the housing in that area, and for that matter, to even afford any sort of formal accommodation within Johannesburg. Okay, but then, however, in spite of all these controversies, the precinct's developer over here, he was named as the 30 most promising young entrepreneurs in Africa, and Mabuning was also voted as one of the top 12 coolest places in the world, imagine, by Forbes magazine. However, in 2009, so just a year later, then 18 buildings in the development were auctioned off after Liebman's company was then liquidated, and it was called perpetuity, and the company actually owed creditors hundreds of millions of rands. Um, all the buildings were then put up for auction, and they fetched prices lower, about 53% to 86% below the prices that perpetuity either bought them for or mortgaged them for. So then you had um, the next slide. Then you had these headlines like Mabuning sold for a song, or if you can see right at the bottom, it says artisan lofts in Mabuning sold for peanuts, so not sold for a lot of money then. So the liquidators then laid much of the blame then on the economic conditions in South Africa at the time, and rentals were also poor because of economic pressures on residents, and the cost of security to ensure that this small part of the city was safe was also very high. Um, the liquidators, they also cited material underperformance in terms of property sales, overly optimistic asset selection, limited management capacity, and excessive gearing and operational challenges. Okay, this led to some then fearing the demise of the precinct, and you had headlines in the newspaper like this: Joburg gentrification dream, Mabuning goes up in smoke. But then you had some people who were actually optimistic, and they felt that the precinct was actually entering a new phase, and some called Mabuning then a change creature and the life after Liebman phase. It was also seen as a new opportunity, then an opportunity for a more shared vision for the regeneration of the city, instead of just being the dream of one person, that being Jonathan Liebman. And the shift in the character was also seen as not the end, but then also rather as a reincarnation then of the precinct. And there were also a number of positive newspaper articles that cast these developments in a positive light. Like you can see, the heart of Mabuning beats on. But then the COVID-19 pandemic actually came along. Sorry. And you had headlines then like this. Sorry, another one. Um, Another one. Sorry, those were just some of the positive headlines. And then with COVID-19, you had headlines like this: Mabaneng then struggling to keep its vibe going. And as you can see, very, very few people then outside Pata Pata, which also offered, it was a restaurant that also offered nice live music. Okay, in 2011, when I went back to Mabaneng and we were sort of coming out of the lockdown regulations, I thought that I would see something like this, quiet streets, the vibrancy of the neighborhood being lost. But I was actually quite surprised because instead of this declining urban vitality that was observed in many cities across the world at the time, the area actually seemed more vibrant before. Businesses seemed to be thriving and streets were much busier than what I remembered. But it was quite different to what I had actually seen in Woodstock in Cape Town earlier, where it was quieter, businesses were closed down, some shops were even shuttered, or some people would maybe only come open up their shops maybe once or twice a week. But gone with the security guards, the that used to police Mabaneng as well. They were the ones who, sort of in a subtle way, they were guarding who could come into Mabaneng and also who could go out. There also appeared to be more local residents than ever before, although there were much less foreign tourists than what I had seen before before COVID-19. Then I also noticed some informal photographers on the street, and that was actually something new. Um, as you can over here we see the name Abeneng. That's one of the most popular streets in the neighborhood, and these photographers were actually taking photographs of people, and they were probably then posting these onto their Instagram or their Facebook and showing others that they're living their best life then in Mabeneng. um, there were also more informal traders before informal trade didn't really take place in Mabaneng. The types of shops that were there were very much curated by the developers. So it was a much more different Mabaneng, a Mabaneng that seemed to be catering more to the needs of the surrounding community, um, um, especially the people. I'll show you an image later then of Jewel City, which was a new development in the area. Even the school kids were walking one afternoon that I was there as well. The school kids were also from Jeppes were also walking through the area. And before, you would not have actually seen that happening. Okay, so much of the increased traffic then was due to Jewel City, which was launched then actually early on in the pandemic, but obviously it was a development that had started before. It was launched in September 2020, where you had um, these high-rise apartments, but they were more affordable high-rise apartments. And incidentally, also the developers also tried to incorporate green principles into the building as well. So Beg noted then that the Mabaneng has seemingly then morphed into its purpose then from being a weekend outing for tourists or visitors from Joburg's northern suburbs. So often Mabaneng in the past would be very full because people would come to the Saturday markets that they had there. And beyond seeking foods and arts, it now appears to be an attraction for the locals, and then many of whom live in jewel cities. These observations then led me to question, was Mabaneng degentrifying? Was this a new form of gentrification taking place with black gentrifiers then being the main drivers of this process? Or was Mabaneng then maybe just becoming a more inclusive place then where people did not feel excluded then from participating then in the offerings of the area? But then last year, when I went back to Mabaneng, there was sort of this shift again. But perhaps it was also The timing of when I went there, although I think previously it was also in the week, but maybe it was on a Friday when it was much more bustling. But the place seemed a little bit more quieter. The once vibrant Arts on Main that I showed you earlier was empty. The restaurant was also closed down. There were not many people there at all. But on the other hand, I also noticed more bars and less restaurants in the area and also more clubs. So maybe there's also a shift in demographic where there's more younger people coming to the area as well. And perhaps we can call it a kind of clubbification happening in Maboneng, because some of the residents also say that the area's also become much more noisier because of the clubs in the area. Um, so most of the hipsters were also gone. One of the residents told me some had moved to Rosebank, which there's also sort of this, what would I call it, like sort of an art street also developing. We've got art galleries and artists establishing themselves in this street. Then one of the coffee shop owners also said to me, they're waiting to bring Maboneng down to its knees. Um, so he was referring them to the developers because he was actually sort of pining for the time when Maboneng was vibrant and you had all of these artists and had a lot of these hipsters in the area. But at the same time, he also stated those who wait will reap the benefits then. In other words, what he was alluding to then was that gentrification may be reignited in the future when conditions would be more favorable again then for the landlords and also for private developers. In other words, when there may be just the right type of rent gap for your developers in the area. So there are signs that processes of gentrification are then slowing in Maboneng. It's sort of as though it's stalling even in Woodstock in Cape Town. But as Peter Marcuse said quite long ago when he was speaking about earlier gentrification in other parts of the world, well, that's even pre-COVID-19. I mean, in 1991, he said the opposite of gentrification shouldn't be decay and abandonment. Because sometimes people's argument is often, so what's wrong with all this uplift in an area? Um, we should be making the place better. But the question is, why can't we have the upliftment and the regeneration, and we have the people still, the original people still living there? Why must they leave? Why can't we make the place nice for the original residents who are there? Slater also calls this also a false choice or false choice urbanism, because you can't choose between the one or the other. So going back then to Marcuse's quote, he says the opposite of gentrification should not be decay and abandonment, but it should be the democratization of housing. In other words, making housing more accessible to all people then. So then what can we do? What can we do then to mitigate gentrification? Um, there have been protests, there have been a lot of resistance to gentrification, especially in Cape Town, where gentrification is at a much more advanced stage. People have also challenged the evictions in court, so the law has played an important part, and lawyers have played an important part in actually protecting people and making them more resilient against eviction and unscrupulous landlords or developers. Um, so Marcuse also said that when with degentrification, it can also be a golden opportunity then for local governments to buy properties cheaply and to turn them into much needed low income housing. It's also an opportunity for government to privilege the needs and the interests of the people who were there originally, or the people, say in the case of Johannesburg's inner city, the people who were denied access because of apartheid, rather than those who stand in to profit from the developments in this area. Um, so this will also help to ease the housing crisis that South Africa currently faces, instead of exacerbating it like gentrification has. Because what gentrification does, it actually limits the amount of affordable housing that is available to people. And if you think about Cape Town, there's actually a surplus of housing for the middle class or for the extremely rich people. And many of the people in South Africa cannot actually even afford some of those houses that we find in Cape Town. And I think to date, in the case of Woodstock, they've actually promised affordable housing, but to date, none of that has actually taken place. So policy interventions and practices also need to need to be proposed and developed that serve then to protect long-time residents from the negative impacts of gentrification. These policies should not only ensure that people are resilient to these negative outcomes, but they also should seek to prevent the displacement of poor and marginalized people in the first place. I mean, before you even had researchers and developers saying, ah, but what's the displacement of just a few people? There's going to be greater benefits. Government's going to get more money, more revenue. The developers are probably saying they're going to make a lot more profit. But we do need to seek ways of of preventing displacement. Okay, and this is especially so in South Africa because of our history then of forced removals. Okay, so apart from physically dislocating people from their homes, displacement then also leads to the reproduction of urban poverty, as well as then increased inequality. And interestingly, Richard Florida, who's actually made a lot of money in different parts of the world promoting creative cities, um, he said that the COVID-19 pandemic, or rather he sees the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity to reshape cities then in more equitable ways. And one of the most effective ways of actually protecting vulnerable people against displacement as a result of gentrification is through rent control. But in South Africa, rent control statutes fell away in maybe 2006. The date's just out of my head now. But what rent control actually does is that of, it actually preserves the neighborhood's affordability. But at the same time, maybe you're thinking to me, but what about the landlords? But a balance should also be found where the landlords can actually make enough money, but at the same time, their tenants also um, pay then a reasonable rent for their accommodation. It also allows existing tenants then to remain in their neighborhoods, to stay put and to remain resilient. So therefore, there's a need for alternatives to gentrification. It's more urgent than ever, given how socially unjust this process has actually progressed through time and space. And we actually, in South Africa, we need a more sustainable and inclusive model then of urban redevelopment for inner city areas in South Africa, and one that actually takes into account the needs of all who live within the country, and not only just the middle class people or the elite. So in conclusion then, we need to, as Marcuse argues then, expose the root of displacement. In this case, the root is gentrification. We need to propose alternative actions because in South Africa at the moment, I don't think there's any city in the country that actually has a policy on gentrification at all. So policies they need to be put in place, and we also need to think about alternative actions that would suit each city depending on their context and what is happening there. And at the same time, we also need to politicize displacement and eviction so that what people propose, what we maybe propose as academics, or the alternatives that we find as researchers, so that that can actually be put into action. So in other words, to make people more aware, to have this collective consciousness about gentrification, that it's not this positive process that's going to get rid of crime and clean up inner city areas. Because, say, for example, in Johannesburg, maybe you remove the bad buildings or you remove the people illegally living there. But what do you think is going to happen? Those people are just going to find places to live elsewhere. So unless we actually find housing and build affordable and decent housing for people, the problem's just not going to go away. It's just going to be shifted somewhere else. So at this stage, the future of the Mabaning precinct is actually an open question. I think we can't actually predict what is actually going to happen. So as Hira and Lise noted, they said COVID-19 is a health and financial disaster that capitalism is likely then to exploit then to create disaster gentrification. You often also find disaster gentrification happening in say, which place can I think of? Um, in what is it? It's not Louisiana, in New Orleans, yes, where they had all of that flooding as well, and it was a huge disaster. But what happened was when they actually rebuilt those homes, often those homes were more expensive than what they ever were before, and therefore that then excludes many of the people who lived in the area before. Okay, so as then just to end what Marcus then says again, so no logic can actually predict what the future of cities will be. So we will just have to then wait and see what the future of Mapaneng holds. But then in the meantime, cities should look for alternatives and put proposals in place that would make the place more sustainable and more inclusive of not only then the middle class, but then also of your working class people, the poor, and the marginalized. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ah Goo. That was really an insightful presentation. I never knew that the displacement was such a big problem. I always thought, oh, pretty cities. Okay, so we'll move into the Q&A session now. So I think we'll take two at a time, and then you can answer them. Is there anyone that has a question?
I didn't realize that it went so fast.
Maybe I should start.
Yes, please, Prof.
Thanks very much, Dr. Delia, for a very insightful presentation on an issue which is very topical, especially in the context of the city of Cape Town. And when I was listening to you, I realized how complicated the issue is because we need to balance different aspects of sustainability. So it will depend on the context. It can be environmental sustainability, it can be cultural sustainability, and even economic sustainability. And when I looked at the slide where you talked about what we can do to mitigate gentrification, you talked about litigation on the basis of the right to housing and eviction. I also think that it may be possible for us to use the right to culture to be able to challenge some of these gentrification projects. I want, because we have the right to preserve our cultural heritage in terms of our laws. And I was wondering if you've come across any project where that was invoked to challenge and halt such a project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Prof, for your question. Yeah, absolutely. Even in Mabaneng, I didn't actually include, sorry, not Mabaneng, in Woodstock in Cape Town, I didn't actually include the resistance strategies, but people have actually used that because Woodstock is such a close-knit community with an extremely strong identity, and they've actually mobilized that identity to try and resist displacement. And one of the methods they actually used was on Heritage Day. I can't remember in which year it was, but they actually had this memory walk where they walked around the neighborhood and tried to invoke the memories of the past, the memories of what the neighborhood was like before, speaking to people about what place was here and what place was there before. Because remember also Woodstock is also right next door, District 6, and District 6 was razed to the ground. So they have family members who live there. Some of them also moved to Woodstock, and they used Heritage Day then also to invoke this memory of the past, and also the and try and also preserve their cultural identity. So yeah, yes, absolutely. But on the flip side, also you also have in some places where developers actually use that cultural identity of these gentrifying spaces and try to sell these neighborhoods as authentic places with this unique and cultural identity, like that Kaka'aku that I showed you in Honolulu. You'll see there lots of images of people who previously lived there, um, the residents who were there in the past, the names of all the old streets and so on. But actually, very few of those people live there anymore. So often, heritage is invoked by these developers to actually sell.
Thank you.
No.
It's for the recording.
I suggest you, yeah.
I just pushed it.
Okay, there we go. I hope I'm audible for the recording. So thank you for the presentation. It's uh, I could resonate with a lot that was being said. Some of my colleagues in the room who had the opportunity to go to Maboneng during the day. I think some people had a bit of a cultural shock about all the things that are going on there, because as you correctly mentioned, there is a good balance of interactions, the street photography and all of these type of things that are going on. So I just want to find out from you in terms of public participation processes for the creation of these precincts. So obviously with Maboneng and others, you have either a special rating area or you have a city improvement district model within specific cities. There's a policy usually for that, and that includes a public participation process. So this public participation process is not just for the what do you call the homeowners or the people that are owning businesses, but all the people within that specific area have a right to voice their opinions in relation to this proposed development. So shouldn't that then be used as a platform for them to challenge the development of these type of areas? At the end of the day, I believe that it's a good initiative to have this upliftment within specific areas. But as we see now with Maboneng, there's the big wigs, so to speak, the fat cats have made their money, they've moved out. Now you have the residents and the people that are staying there, and they should be the ones that try to keep that spark or that fire going for the area in order to take it to the next stage. What are your thoughts just on that public participation aspect? If this is even something that people are considering, of the even movements on the ground, if they're even being correctly informed about these processes? If you could just comment on that.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, so definitely Maboneng was part of a CID. It's definitely a community improvement district, but like I said, driven then by just one developer. And yes, the developer even had, if I can think, you're speaking about public participation. I'll come to that now. But he also tried to involve the community around there by having these skateboard parks. Some of the community members would have kids from the surrounding Jeppystown come along and skateboard, or there was maybe a little nursery school formed in the area and so on. But those things were actually it didn't have a really big impact on the community. So maybe it's sort of you're doing something because you feel a little bit guilty about the surrounding community. But then in terms of public participation, I'm not sure how much of that actually happened in Maboneng. In Woodstock, it has definitely happened, and you have a very strong activist group over there. They also have what you call advice assemblies as well, and even for people who are being evicted. So there is a public participation process, but often we call that participation like this, it's sort of a con. Yeah, you get all the community members in and you say, oh, there, I did my public participation. It's a checkbox that I can tick off. But are you actually then implementing those things that people actually spoke about? Are you taking their needs into account? And the answer is it's probably not, because none of the social housing has actually happened in Cape Town. So yes, they have had those public participation processes, physical meetings, documents that have even been sent out to people where people can comment on, but none of that has actually taken place. So yeah, um, participation actually has to be meaningful, and it has to have an impact on community members for it to be worth anything in the first place.
Thank you. Since my mic is still on, may I share? Not just a follow-up, just a comment, perhaps perhaps we could speak afterwards about it, but and to get some of the lawyers' opinions as well, because that should be a ground for them to actually challenge the development of a special rating area, which in turn becomes a city improvement district, depending on how the policy is set up. But yeah, so without, as you mentioned, the actual meaningful participation, nothing really takes place. So thank you for your response and thank you for your presentation.
Thanks. And when were you in Mabaneng, by the way? Oh, sorry, Chick, can I ask the question?
We were in Maboneng, I think it was 2022,
Oh, okay.
2020. Why is 2023? Okay, yeah, 2020. You mustn't expose yourself. I said with colleagues. So 2023, we got the opportunity to go to Maboneng on an excursion.
Okay.
So it was very enlightening. But yeah, so fantastic initiative taken there. But it's for, I think the people of that area should be embracing that culture and just taking it to the next level.
Your question, please.
Just to the hand side of the microphone.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Delia. I just wanted to get more insight. Firstly, you said that this whole gentrification thing reminds us of the Group Areas Act. So regarding the current land reform, land expropriation ongoing thing in this country, what do you think? Is there really a hope in us having gentrification policies in place, given that that's also still an issue from historical factors? Like, is there really a hope then towards gentrification policies being a thing in our country? Thank you.
Yeah. I think we can try. We can certainly try. And like Dr. Wendy was mentioning earlier, I was working on a project in Stellenbosch, and we actually formulated a policy that was then sent to the mayor of Stellenbosch. But I don't think she's actually I'm not sure how far she has actually gotten with that. So it would also, yes, it would also depend to a large extent on the political will of the people in power. But I think we shouldn't stop there. If there is a way in which we can affect policy in some way, certainly we should try to do something about it. Because we cannot go back to what was there in the past. How can it be with 30 years on in democracy, people are still suffering, people still don't have decent and affordable housing, and people being relocated to peripheries of cities? I mean, I think that is totally not acceptable.
It was very interesting for me to learn that there is no city in the country that has a policy on gentrification. I was expecting Cape Town to have one, given the importance of this in their context. And I was wondering if you had the opportunity to look at things like their spatial development frameworks, spatial development plans, to be able to see, or even bylaws, to be able to see if gentrification is regulated from the perspective of those instruments, and not just policy.
Yeah, I don't think so. I haven't looked at the more recent ones, but I know in the past gentrification wasn't really mentioned as something that they would curb or the displacement of people at all. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just thinking now, it's also sort of a mindset change because initially people were very positive about gentrification. It's like this great thing, and you would even see housing, ads for houses in Woodstock where they would say, um, wonderful historic area, um, um, great gentrification taking place. So it was sort of cast in this very positive light. So yeah, I think um, I can't think of it being in any of those spatial development frameworks then.
Okay, thank you. My question is also related to profs, but I just wanted to ask, since there's no specific policy on gentrification, are there any specific or related policy levers that can be used to direct private developers towards socially responsible investments that also respect the cultural identity of that particular area? Thank you.
Thanks. Can you just repeat that first part of your question again?
Okay, are there any specific or any related policy levers, like, that can be leveraged that are not like, that are not specific to gentrification, but that are related, that can be leveraged to direct private developers to ensure that they do socially responsible investments that respect the cultural identity of that particular area.
Yeah. So in some instances, developers have sort of tried where they would say they've got like a socially responsive development where part of it would be like kind of social housing, but then that social housing would maybe an apartment costs 5,000 rand rent per month, and to many people that is actually not affordable, but to the developers they see it as affordable housing. Um, and like I said earlier on, they have tried to um, use culture, but then the culture, although it belongs to the people who actually live there, but the culture is being used in the developer's interest rather than in the interests of the people who actually live there.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Delia. That was a very insightful presentation. But in order to ask my question, I would like to read something to set the context. Because you made mention that why can't we gentrify and still keep the original people? But simultaneously, but we all acknowledge that, or some of us share the perspective that if you look at the South African cities, most of them were like occupied by, let's say, whites. Then after the demise of apartheid, we saw the influx of blacks coming in, which obviously they couldn't really afford those spaces. So like kind of municipal services were lost. So don't you think once you make mention of the original residents, do you mean the white residents who were there before, or those people who took over, or who, after the influx of the blacks, are they the original residents, or because I don't really get it if you say original residents.
Okay, yeah, so maybe I should clarify. So in the case of Woodstock, it's a mixed community, so it's people of different races and different ethnicities. So it's a working class community. So it's not there were white residents in the past, but most of them had moved out as in fact a lot of them were immigrants from other countries. So you had people coming from Europe, or even as far as Russia, you had people coming from Asia as well, the Pakistanis and people from Bangalore, but those and the Dutch, of course, in the English, and that was all in the past, and of course the original inhabitants of South Africa. So Woodstock is in fact, a very rare community in South Africa because it's this mixed race community. And in fact, it withstood, I should have actually put that in as well, it withstood apartheid. So it was never ever a group area. It was never ever um, changed into being designated a white group area. It stayed mixed. It became a gray area. So Woodstock was able to resist apartheid, but now it's actually finding it difficult to resist this new form of apartheid. So when I speak about the original residents in that case, it would be the mixed community, or if we refer to the original residents in other parts of the world, that then it would be the original working class community. And they could be white residents, they could be black residents, but often in these working class communities, they're often then um, minorities in the global, your minority communities in the global south. And in the case of Maboneng, yes, I guess Maboneng was actually an industrial area before, so it didn't really have a residential component. Yes, so maybe um, I would say then think of the original residents then as being your working class people. So working class people then, irrespective of their race, being replaced. But in this case then, in Maboneng's case then, it's also the Jeppestown community, which is a black community who can't access housing in that area.
Okay. Can I follow up?
Mhm.
Because like when I hear of your topic, I try to like cast my mind to Hebrew and places like St. George's in Durban, which used to be occupied by white affluent. Now, after the demise of apartheid, a lot of foreign migrants moved in. So if you take the case of Hebrew, for instance, people have the perception that most of the buildings has been hijacked. So in case gentrification should take place in a place like Hebrew or let's say St. George's in Durban, do you still like have to have the gentrifier residents, or we should bring those migrants back after the place has been gentrified?
But you see, that's the question then that I say that people often ask: why do you have to have gentrification in order to renew a person? Renew a place. Why can't you renew a place without gentrification? Why can't you have just plain and simple urban redevelopment and not gentrification? Um, and if those migrants don't have a place to stay, I mean, obviously, they would have to find, government would have to find places, affordable places for people to live. Because remember, I mean, you guys would know the Constitution very well. I mean, everyone has a right to housing in South Africa.
Okay, thank you very much.
You, sir, in the back first, and then we'll take Wendy's question, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Delia. Yeah, this word gentrification kept me awake the other day because it was my first time when I saw this topic. And I was thinking, I thought maybe one of the most important aspects to mitigate gentrification would have been looking at sensitization on the mentality of the people. As a mentality and ideology, because I think practically it comes from the mentality of certain groups of people that immediately a particular area is occupied by this type of people. I'm not supposed to live alongside these people. So why can it, why do we think sensitization on the mentality, that's what people think about others, it can be another aspect to mitigate gentrification.
Okay, thank you. So what you're saying then that the way people view others.
Sensitization on the way people reason and think about others.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you actually find is that often in the beginning, the initial gentrifiers, they often come to those areas because of so-called social mix, and they think it's diverse and all of that. But what actually happens is they are on the one side and the original residents on the other side, and they don't actually mix, and they live side by side, and there's not much mixing that actually takes place because um, I suppose maybe people are just, I don't know, different or but you're absolutely right. There should be some sort of sensitization, and maybe the initial gentrifiers are more open to mixing, but as soon as gentrification um, intensifies and develops, even the initial gentrifiers get displaced, and you have even more higher middle class people moving in. And think about in London or New York, you have the super rich then moving into these gentrifying spaces. So even the middle class actually gets displaced, and you have what is called financialization or super gentrification. So not even the middle class is safe, but absolutely there should be this mixing. And I mean, if we think about South Africa, I think in all of our spaces we have those problems and the othering of people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delia. This was a very interesting presentation. My question is more out of curiosity. Like, what happens then after degentrification? What is life after degentrification? Because I'm thinking of the Maboning, as you said, that when you went there or um, out of I don't know what you have seen going on now that, for example, there are no security guards who are in the streets and everything. I'm assuming that maybe crime rates will go up as well. And won't that take back Maboneng to the place that it was before gentrification? And will that maybe cause another developer to come and propose a new idea, maybe gentrification in another form or in the same form, because now it would have gone back to where it was before, this developer that tried to develop this place? Won't it go back to that place before and give way for another developer? What is life after that? And are they maybe places either here in Africa or maybe in the global north where it has happened before gentrification, so that we can maybe see best practices on how to handle it and how to make it more inclusive, or to balance the negative effects then of gentrification with the more positive effects of it? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question. So I think it's quite difficult to predict, and like I said, it depends on uh, whether developers actually see that they can gain something out of Maboneng. As one of the residents was actually telling me, some there were even American investors who had started investing in Maboneng as well, because they see Maboneng as like the Brooklyn of South Africa. So they see similarities between Maboneng and Brooklyn. So depending on whether they're going to invest further in the area or leave that building for it to sell it at a later stage, it would all depend on that and the value that people actually find in Maboneng. But across the world, in many cases, there've been like sort of these ebbs and flows and these different stages. So gentrification would go up and then it would go down again. But then again, in other parts of the world, like your big cities like London and New York, you have that more super gentrification taking place, where even homeowners, I mean, people who earn enough money, who have beautiful homes, but then they can't afford the rates and taxes, and they eventually have to then sell their homes. But I think it's really difficult to predict what is actually going to happen. But it seems to be a much more vibrant place with more local people in Mapaneng at the moment. In the past, you would see a lot of tourists in Mapaneng, and it was quite quiet in the week. And you don't really see, there are some tourists, and I think at one stage I even saw an old South African actor, so a celebrity is still coming to the area, but it's changed because of the bars and the young people and the clubs. So there's definitely a change in that sense, and with less of the artists being in the areas.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting. Listening to it, I can't help thinking of the opposite, and I might be a little bit far out with this. And if I am, you can correct me on it. But we see, like, as you've spoken about gentrification, where middle class people or more rich people move into poorer areas and then upgraded. Whereas we have the opposite these days also of social development or social housing, where government tries to move poorer people into more middle class areas with subsidized housing. So it's kind of just a hypothetical thought or probe. And like, have you seen social development housing play a role in gentrification? And if not, do you think maybe it would be an option into considering if we're like people come with a project to upgrade a specific old area, the government might have a set rule where they're like, okay, great. We also need to have a space for people living in this area for social housing where they have subsidized housing within that specific area and the whole area gets upgraded and no one gets displaced. Yeah, that's just a thought.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting question, and it just reminds me also what happened in Cape Town, where you had social housing like RDP housing in one of the areas over there, and that actually also showed elements of gentrification, because what happened was that um, one of the companies actually bought these RDP houses for their workers, and in turn those houses were then renovated, and I think it was Lemansky, and she actually calls this a form of hybrid gentrification, because here you've got social housing, but at the same time that social housing is then actually being used um, for um, for being bought up then by middle class employers then for their employees. So yeah, thanks for that interesting question.
Thanks so much, Dr. Zilia. Um, uh, I want to cite one example of redevelopment that has gone wrong, and that's Potchefstroom. The town center was full of beautiful old buildings, and the developers pulled them down and replaced them with rather ugly modern commercial buildings. Do you have any tips? Because the city council is not paying any attention to that. It must be the community. How can you sensitize the community to stand up against such kind of redevelopment?
I think what I've seen, like say in Stellenbosch, they would have a heritage committee, and that heritage committee actually plays a very active role in the community. And I think that is one of the places where communities can get together. And yeah, I don't know Potchefstroom that well, but I have seen also some of those buildings interspersed in between some really ugly buildings. So yes, I agree with you, and I agree that those buildings should be preserved, and I suppose also making them national monuments. I'm not sure how old the buildings are in Potch as well, but yeah, I think getting a heritage committee would go a long way to actually working towards preserving the buildings. And at the same time, in Stellenbosch, that Heritage Committee also makes sure that there aren't projects that take place that would be bad for the community. as well. So yeah, thank you for that interesting question. Sorry, I don't have more concrete tips on what actually to do.
Thank you, Chair. I first thought that I'm not going to ask these questions because I don't know how to formulate it. So please bear with me and try to track my thoughts in this. If I can clash onto that example of Potch. The biggest problem in Potch is obviously corruption as well. Developers paying city council and so forth to go forth with the development. And then obviously all of the effects with it. But the mayor of City of Joburg also said that they're going to use what's that law? Bear with me. Without compensation, at first word, expropriation without compensation, or for nil compensation for all those hijacked buildings. So, in terms of all those buildings, there's obviously going to be people replaced as well. But the government, or can I say the public trust in government currently is so low that we know more or less that there's going to happen some corruption, and that actually exorbitate the whole displacement and all the negative effects that there is. How can, and obviously then we early on spoke of public participation. There's a nice word called malicious compliance for public participation, and that's why all of those, and that's also, let's say, some sort of corruption, if you can say it in that way. How much, or how can this gratification and the sustainability thereof help without, or can I say, how can we get rid of that corruption within this? Because I think that plays a big role, or can I say, make this situation actually worse with displacement, with the social culture being changed, all of those just because of money. So how can we, and I know it's a difficult question in terms of, but how can we turn that around? I know the answer is quite longer and a whole discussion, but if you can just comment on that, maybe.
Oh, sure. I think that's a difficult question. How do we get rid of corruption? Yeah, I mean, that's basically what you're asking, correct?
Well, that's the whole question on its own because we won't be able to do that. But how can we look at the law and the processes to try to keep out that part of government? If I can say it like that, so say for example, Potch, you've got your developers. Isn't there a way or a way of thinking that we say that, okay, but it mustn't be in the hands of the state. There must be other process to be followed when there's development. If you understand what I'm saying, isn't there a way around that? We're not going to solve corruption. I know that, but isn't there a way around it?
Yeah, I think maybe having like public, private participation, that your people coming from together from different organizations, institutions. I mean, academics can also play a role. I think in South Africa, we've become a little quiet now that since the fall of apartheid. And I mean, we should maybe be looking at the scholar activists in ourselves as well and look at ways in which we can use our expertise in actually preventing those situations. So maybe people from different sectors of civil society then forming some sort of partnership could help to prevent it. I'm not sure, but I know that all these hijacked buildings, um, it's such a difficult one. And I think that's what even brought me to gentrification, also even in the first place, because when I looked at Cape Town, there in the city is so beautiful and everyone wants to be there and you don't mind being there. But then you look at Joburg, but of course Joburg is its inner city is much bigger and it's a much larger problem. But um, and in fact a very difficult problem to actually solve because you have all these landlords that have abandoned their buildings. How do you find them? You have your hijack buildings where people think that they're paying money to the landlord every single month, but you're actually paying money to someone who isn't the landlord. And eventually, when the landlord finds out about this, those people are put out on the street because you've been paying the money to the wrong person. So I think Joburg is a very complex and a very difficult problem to actually solve. But I mean, government has to start somewhere, and I don't think they really have started. Um, well, not recently. There were lots of urban regeneration projects that did take place, but a lot of that has that sort of stopped in a sense.
Just a quick comment. I think that Chris Dan may be able to say a bit more on this because his PhD thesis is actually on it. And I think that initially people were excited that courts were giving away the roles of municipalities to private individuals and community-based organizations to be able to do the work and get paid. But I think we had a recent judgment from the High Court in Mafikeng, which Prof. Lemin shared with us, which shows that courts have begun to lose appetite in relation to that, because basically it means at times we hijack functions away from government and want to do it on our own.
That's true.
And I think that corruption is a problem in Poch, but the biggest problem that we've had that has really led to the collapse of our infrastructure is the redistribution that takes place as a result of the measure of Ventersdorp and local municipality in 2016. There was advice against it, and the Municipal Demarcation Board decided to play a political game to ensure that the ANC retains control of this area, and that is why both municipalities were merged. An article was published in the Journal of Public Administration, which did empirical research, and it was established that the amalgamation of both municipalities has done more harm than good. A lot of the rates and taxes come from Poch, but we use it to fund Ventersdorp and also to develop urban sprawl, both in Ventersdorp and here in Poch. So that is where a lot of the money gets wasted. And we inherited a lot of debt from Ventersdorp local municipality, which we had to pay, and no provision was made for it by the Department of Cooperative Governance to pay such debt. So the biggest problem has been the merger of those municipalities, and people have been fighting for it to be, for the municipalities to be separated, and residents of both cities, they agree in terms of that research that it's done more harm than good, and we should split up the municipalities again, or the municipality again, so that at least we can have one which is properly functioning. Yeah. You want to say more, Chris then?
I will wait for my opportunity to come and present at the Prestige lecture in a few years.
You like it.
Just a follow-up question. And I think that's an international trend question currently. Is there still a need for government? Obviously, in terms of what we look at in law, but is there still a need for governance or governments? Not only governance, there's definitely a need for, but governments. And I think it's a rhetorical question. I think it's the answer. And Prof, we can have a nice discussion about JB Marks of Ventersdorp. I was part of that process. So.
Hi, Doc. So earlier on in your presentation, you referred to gentrification in rural areas. I just want to know how this would look like. Is it like the middle class basically moving from the city to rural areas because of the high costs of or the standard of living due to gentrification in the city, or is it something else?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for your question. So to bring Stellenbosch up again as the example, so what happened is we all know Stellenbosch is quite an expensive city to live in, so even the middle class needs to find a place to stay. And what has happened is that they've moved in out to the periphery of the city. And as we know, what is the apartheid city like? You're going to have the more lower income people living on the periphery, but in Stellenbosch, those areas are still beautiful and they've got beautiful mountains and beautiful scenery. So the middle class is also then moving to the edges of the city, to your little rural hamlets like Jamestown and Raithby and so on. So that is what rural gentrification would actually look like. And but then the housing typology would be totally different, because then you would have the new builds like what do you call them? Those gated complexes. So that is what it would look like over there. So yeah, so rural gentrification then would be your middle classes then moving to your rural areas. Sometimes it can also happen with second homes, where people have second homes in rural areas, but maybe those second homes were then in places that were once working class areas.
I think we'll take the final round of questions. Does anyone have one left? Nobody? Okay. Yes, please.
It's so awkward having a microphone on when you're speaking to the person right next to you. So there must be some good in gentrification, not only bad. I was listening to the part of your presentation where you spoke about where this single developer came in and created green spaces. And then when Jewel City was created, we would probably see a little bit less of those. I'm asking the question, does something like gentrification bring to the fore forgotten environmental concerns? Something like climate change, for instance. There could be a large mitigation possibility in something like gentrification, bringing green spaces into a space where they were not. So just a question on, to what extent do you think gentrification has the potential of actually bringing something positive to the sustainability discussion?
I'm not sure about the positive part, but it does bring to the sustainable part, because we do have what we call also green gentrification. So sometimes, often developers may have good intentions. You may have, I want to have this nice green space in this area, but then what often happens is that those green spaces and the better environment actually then attracts the middle classes to those spaces. So sustainability can also foster green gentrification at the same time. So for me, I would argue that because there's displacement, gentrification can never be a good thing. So if you're always, if and even people would also argue that there were no people maybe living in an area, say in Maboneng, some of the maybe in the industrial parts, there were no people living in the industrial spaces, but people often feel indirect displacement, because now you can't maybe go to the new coffee shop, or you can't go to the new restaurant, or you can't buy a house or buy an apartment in that space. So they are then subtly or indirectly also being displaced. So even in the new build developments, people would say, oh no, this is a green open space. There was no one living there. But if you're doing it in a working class area, you're diminishing the amount of housing for working class people. So um, it's still indirect displacement. Or people also feel indirect displacement when Prof was speaking about identity. Yeah, your neighborhood's changing. Suddenly, the people in the neighborhood aren't like you. They're middle class people, they're hipsters, and you may be more working class, and you're used to your neighbors, and your neighbors are moving out. And that displacement pressure that people also feel, that also indirectly displaces them.
Do you have any final remarks, Dr. Ah Goo?
Um, Yeah, no, I think you guys have also opened up. So thank you very much for all the questions, and you've also opened up my mind to different things and different ways of viewing gentrification. So thank you for all of your questions as well, because you've also just piqued my mind and made me think of gentrification in different ways. And yeah, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you for inviting me, and yeah, and thank you for the discussion. I learned a lot from you guys too, so thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Prof. Hua, for opening on behalf of CLES. Thank you, Prof. Barnard, for opening on behalf of the faculty. Thank you, Dr. Ah Goo, for being here. We have a little token of our gratitude here. And yeah, then that is the end of the prestige lecture. There is some refreshments waiting for us on the ductane, as it's called. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Oh, thank you. No, thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Is that your daughter who greeted them?
Yeah.
Oh, you can